Hi, everybody.
I'm actually going to open up the chat. I always get curious about what people are saying in there.
Don't see anything coming up yet, but I'm glad to see that people are coming on into the room.
Yeah.
Look forward to sharing some thoughts about Millie Dresselhaus with everybody. I'm going to shut my video for just one moment.
All right. Canada in the house. Thank you for joining. Well, I'm coming live to you from the Cambridge area, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we have Laurie.
Yeah, I'm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I'm a faculty member at the University of North Carolina.
All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody. I'm Elisa, and I'm an event staffer at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I would like to welcome you to PNP Live. We appreciate you joining us in this virtual format in the midst of these continuously extraordinary times, throughout all of which we've been working to bring you the authors you love and their books to our PNP community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Carbon Queen on the Politics and Prose website. If you look near the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. You can click there to submit a question to the author. And while we try our best to get to everyone's questions, we apologize in advance if we run out of time before we get to yours. We'll also be providing closed captions if you click on the CC link right next to the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen. Before we begin, I would like to say thank you again for being here. We're really grateful for you all helping keep our business and spirits afloat. And now I would like to welcome to PNP Live, Maia Weinstock, celebrating the release of her book, Carbon Queen, The Remarkable Life of Nanoscience Pioneer Mildred Dresselhaus. Maia Weinstock is an editor, writer, and producer of science and children's media, whose work has appeared in Scientific American, Discover, Space.com, Brain Pop, and Scholastic Science World. She is deputy editorial director at MIT News, a lecturer at MIT on the history of women in STEM, and creator of Lego's Women of NASA. In Carbon Queen, science writer Maia Weinstock describes how, with curiosity and drive, Dresselhaus defied expectations and forged a career as a pioneering scientist and engineer. Dresselhaus made highly influential discoveries about the properties of carbon and other materials, and helped reshape our world in countless ways, from electronics to aviation to medicine to energy. She was also a trailblazer for women in STEM and a beloved educator, mentor, and colleague. Weinstock will be in conversation with Laurie McNeil, the Bernard Gray Distinguished Professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at UNC Chapel Hill. She serves as a deputy editor at the Journal of Applied Physics. Professor McNeil is a materials physicist who uses optical spectroscopy to investigate the properties of semiconductors and insulators. She has worked throughout her career to enhance the representation and success of women in physics. Please join me in welcoming Maia Weinstock and Laurie McNeil to PNP Live.
Well, I know we're both delighted to be here and to be talking about a very special person and quite a wonderful book with all of you here today. So why don't we begin? Why don't you tell me and tell everybody else what prompted you to write this book, and who do you think should read it in order to learn more about Millie Dresselhaus's life and career?
Oh, I'd love to answer those questions. But first, thank you so much, Elisa and Politics and Prose for hosting us, and to Laurie for being here and chatting with me. We will get to this later, but just so everyone knows up front, Laurie worked with Millie many years ago as a postdoc at MIT. So we will definitely be getting into some stories from those times. But just to answer your question, yeah, this book, I had known about Millie as someone, well, first just as someone who was interested in women in science. I had first heard about her actually as a reporter at Discover magazine back in 2002. I was working on an article related to high profile women in science at the time. And Millie was sort of on this long list of about 50 women that were being profiled. And I actually remember like every single person on the list. If I ever see their name, even to this day, I still remember who they are. I'm like, that woman was on the list, whether or not I really remember what she did, but I just remember everyone. And when I joined MIT in 2014, I knew there are actually quite a few MIT people from that list. But Millie was one of them. And, she was still active at the time in her research. Even though she was emerita, she was officially retired technically, but she was still producing scholarship. And, we were reporting on it in our office at the MIT News office. And so, I was definitely in awe of just the fact that she was continuing at that time. I honestly was not planning on writing a book, but later, shortly after Millie passed away, I was approached by the MIT Press about writing a biography, and they kind of had a few ideas of people they were considering for profiling in biographies, and Millie's name definitely stood out as one that I thought I really would want to get into, in part because I had known a little bit more about her through my interactions with her at MIT. I had actually met her just one time, but there was sort of an aura about Millie that I had heard about, and I just was, endlessly fascinated. She also, at that time, had only recently won some extremely high-profile awards. She had won many, many, many awards over her career, but in the last few years of her life, she won, the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama. She also she won the Kavli Prize in 2012. She won this really prestigious IEEE award. She was the first woman to do that. So I kind of, knew about her and wanted to get a little bit into, her background, and decided that she was someone that I wanted to spend a lot of my personal life getting to know. So that's kind of how I got into it. And yeah.
Yeah, your remarks about the prizes that Millie won, throughout her career. I remember being at her, I guess it was her 70th birthday celebration at MIT, and the then chair of the physics department said that he had established a tradition of every year there would be a party that would honor all of the members of the faculty who had won prestigious awards that year. And someone asked him, well, what do you do in a year when none of the faculty win any prestigious awards? And he said, oh, not to worry, we've got Millie.
I don't doubt that at all. Yeah. Yeah, it was constant. It was pretty constant. I mean, she won something like, I don't remember how many honorary degrees. I think it was in the 30 or 40. Yeah. I have it written in the book somewhere, but it was a large number. And, it kind of, sometimes toward the end, she got to the point where she would actually, in many cases, accept certain awards so that she could be on the awards committee for the following people in the following years. And in that way, she hoped to kind of insert herself into conversations about, equity and these kinds of things. So I thought that was really interesting to learn about. Yeah.
So as you started to dig into her life and looked at a lot of the interviews she gave over the course of her career, what did you find most surprising and interesting about her quite unlikely rise to such a prominent career from quite deep poverty as a child?
Yeah, I think just the fact of her deep poverty and just her circumstances growing up as the daughter of two immigrants who essentially fled, Europe right at the time, right before the Holocaust happened. Most of her family on that side of the ocean perished during the Holocaust. And so, and then, when her two parents did come over, they faced the Great Depression in the middle of, this big metropolis, New York City. And so, yes, I think that that was really one of the biggest surprises to me, was learning just how much she had to overcome in terms of, the opportunities that she really didn't actually have as a child, as a young child. And yet just her persistence through those. And so, the other thing I would say that was really surprising is the role that music played in Millie's life, throughout her life. Music actually was such a key spark for her in not only her education, but in seeing a way out of poverty. And so learning this was definitely a surprise. I really knew nothing about her background when I started really writing this book. And so, it's so inspirational. I mean, there's so many different inspirational aspects to Millie's life and career, but it's, the remarkable in my title is true. Like, it is actually remarkable. It is actually, in some cases unbelievable. And at MIT recently, we opened a very new and beautiful and high profile and state of the art nanotechnology center, nanoscience and nanotechnology center, and there's a really beautiful walkway in between that new facility and sort of the older MIT buildings, and it was named in her honor, the Improbability Walk, because of as a nod to her, her trajectory, which is just inspirational in so many ways. And also the walking part was kind of an interesting way to honor her, because, she would just regularly speak with students in the way that that her mentors spoke with her, kind of in a way that was encouraging and, backing young kids, young students rather, I should say, in a way that really gave them some confidence that they knew what they were doing, or at least they could go further. So yeah, I would say those are the two biggest surprises for me. So yeah.
Well, and you've spoken of Millie's mentorship of young people, and she certainly was a tremendously important mentor for me, and that's something that I have treasured throughout my career. Talk a little bit more about some of the mentors that she had and what that tells us about the importance of mentorship in science.
Absolutely. And I'll do that. And then I would love to hear a little bit more about your experiences as a mentee. So, Millie was lucky in that she had a number of really important mentors who really springboarded her into new directions that would ultimately help her develop this career in physics. I would say one of her, lifelong mentors, of course, was her mother. Her mother is someone who, became the main breadwinner in her family when her father had a hard time finding work, and sometimes was ill and unable to provide for their family. So, her mom was a role model for her, and I would say a mentor to her whole life, I would say. But especially in the early parts of her life, she really, she saw through her mom that, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade out of it whenever you can. And Millie certainly espoused that in her whole career and her whole life. So that's someone who's not in science, but without seeing her mom's example, I think she might not have had as much strength in certain ways, I guess. But then, later on, when she was interested in math and science, she was interested in math and science from a fairly early age. But she didn't really think that she had an opportunity to become a scientist, because there were no role models for her early on, like let's say in high school or earlier. She had glimpses of the fact that there were women in science. She had read as a child the biography of Marie Curie by Curie's daughter Eve. But, she was told many times that because she was poor, she really did not have, means to go on to, schools that cost a lot of money. And just, that because she was a woman, that she basically had only a few career opportunities open to her, nursing, secretarial work, and teaching. And, so when she went to college, she thought that she would become a math teacher because she was really excellent at math. And but then she met Rosalind Yallow, who was her physics teacher in her sophomore year at Hunter College. And Rosalind saw her and immediately recognized her brilliance and also her commitment to just excellence in everything that she did. And Rosalind basically, she kind of insisted that, you cannot possibly be a teacher, like, nothing against teachers like make the world go round. But at the same time, Millie was really interested in furthering research, or she clearly had the interest in, just getting to the bottom of like what makes the world work from a scientific, aspect. And so Rosalind Yallow absolutely, made her change her life course by helping her. She suggested colloquia to go to at Columbia University, where some of the world's most well-known physicists at the time were working, Nobel Prize winners and things like this. She, offered, recommendations and things like that. So she really offered a springboard for her. And then later in grad school at Chicago, University of Chicago, she befriended Enrico Fermi, who also was a Nobel Prize winner. And, it was a little bit of a different relationship, but Fermi, who was, world renowned and had already won a Nobel, Yallow had not, Yallow was herself trying to become get herself ingratiated into the research world when she knew Millie. But Fermi, by the time that they met, had already become famous. And so it was a little different, but, he talked with her as they were walking to school and to class. And he just gave her that confidence that, she could hack it in this world. And, she often said that he made her think like a physicist for the first time. And there are many examples of things like just, having a broad spectrum of knowledge within physics, but also in science generally. And that really she really used that many times in her career. And so, yeah, so that was, those people formed, they were extremely formative for her. But then she paid it forward later in her career when she became a mentor. And maybe Laurie, you can talk a little bit more about that. But my understanding is that, she took a lot of those lessons of, really embracing young people and giving them an opportunity to see a future, whatever that future might be, whether it's in, this field that Millie was working on or something else. So yeah, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about like, what was your experience in that?
Sure. I mean, Millie was a tremendously important mentor for me. As was mentioned, I was a postdoc in her group in the early 1980s. And when I left the group, I became a faculty member here at Chapel Hill. And especially in the earlier part of my career as a faculty member, there always seemed to be what I thought of as Millie's Rolodex, which is that people would often ask her for recommendation of someone to serve on some committee or take on some leadership role in something within the professional society or something of that sort, some task and role that would allow not only people to do something useful, but also to become more visible and advance their careers. And she would go through her mental Rolodex and she always seemed to know who needed that particular opportunity at that particular point in their career. And so, I would get asked to do various kinds of things that without Millie, nobody would ever have thought of me for that particular thing. And those were opportunities that allowed me to really enhance my career and learn tremendous amounts of things, not just about science, but also about sort of the way science works, the enterprise, the professional enterprise. And so that for me made a tremendous difference in my career. And I know that I'm far from being the only one for whom that was true. She just always seemed to know who needed what when and would make sure that we got that opportunity.
That's so great. So almost like a scientific or just a career matchmaker in terms of matching people's abilities that maybe even they didn't recognize that they had with opportunities that she knew about. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, I mean, when I would be asked to do something as a result of her recommendation, it wouldn't have occurred to me that that was something I needed to do because it would be a way for me to build skills and experience, but she always knew. So.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Now we've sort of taken Millie up to her graduate work at Chicago, and she received her PhD in 1958. And at that time, of all of the PhDs in physics awarded in the US, about 2% of them went to women. So she was, and there were not very many PhDs being awarded in physics at that time either. So it was a very tiny, tiny minority. By the time I got my PhD, it was all the way up to 6%, and we're now up at about 20%. So it, can you talk a little bit about some of the discrimination and just general difficulties that Millie faced because of being a member of such a tiny minority in physics at that time in her career, and for that matter, all the way through her career?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll start with grad school. So the first very obvious way that she faced discrimination was that her advisor in grad school was not actually Enrico Fermi, but was a man named Andrew Lawson, who was a little bit more in the area of condensed matter physics, which is what she was interested in. Fermi was a little bit more into high energy physics or nuclear physics, which looks more at like particle physics. And she was a little bit more interested in the bulk properties of materials. And so my sense is that she basically was just assigned to this person because he was the one who was, he was the department chair, and he was the one who had that expertise. But, it was a mismatch from the get-go, because he absolutely did not have any interest in having women students. And he basically thought, having, female grad students were a waste of time, both for their time and his time. The prevailing opinion, I guess you could say, among many in academia at the time was that, women would go off and have children and get married, and basically their education would be wasted on them, and other opportunities like, like postdocs or any other, awards that they might be given, should rather be given to men because they will actually use them to further their careers. But if you give it to a woman, that's just a waste. So it sounds kind of archaic, but in fact, this is the mentality that was taking place at that time, and it was not uncommon, which is, definitely something that I saw in a number of different ways as I was doing my research. So she had to basically do her research on her own with help from others who were supportive. There were clearly people in her life, including, for instance, her future husband, Gene Dresselhaus, who was one of a number of people who really did support her even at that stage. But, the fact is her grad advisor, didn't even really know. He told her to get lost so many times that she just did. And she was like, all right, I'm going to do this on my own. And he barely had any idea what she was working on for her PhD until like a couple of weeks before her defense. So she managed to, defend successfully, and clearly, she made it work. I think she also mentioned that there were literally pinup girls in some of the labs at University of Chicago at the time. I would not be surprised if this was a common thing at other places.
It's
later
a common
on
thing now.
And it happens now too. Yeah, I'm sure that's not surprising. But she was able to get a postdoc at Cornell University after that. And at Cornell, she faced similar situation where she didn't really have an advisor who wanted to work with her. Her husband had become a member of the faculty, but she was, a postdoc. And so she had 2 years of funding essentially. And, I remember reading that one professor said, no woman will ever teach my engineering students, I think, to Millie, but just generally saying, women are non-people in our world. And, that was just obviously very frustrating to her. There was an incident in which some professor ended up leaving Chicago or taking a leave. I'm sorry, Cornell. And she was, offering to teach that person's class. The department needed someone. And she was highly qualified to teach it, not only in her physics background, but also in the sense that she had been a math tutor and a tutor of many different subjects, science, math, whatever, growing up in high school and through college. And, she was a great educator already. but apparently the department spent like a week debating not whether she was qualified to teach, but whether the male students would actually listen to her and take her seriously. So, that was just another example. Later in her career, she dealt with people who just didn't want to work with women. And I mean, to her great credit, and frankly, to the credit of her husband, Gene, they were able to just say like, look, we just want to get this work done. I mean, and probably the greatest example of this is that at Cornell, when her postdoc was up, she offered to continue working without getting paid so that they could stay there while Gene was a faculty member. And they said, no, thank you. So basically, Gene decided, you know what, I'm not going to just stay here while you can't work. And so he up and left, and they found places that would offer them opportunities to work together. And, that was a really big support for her. So, but, these kinds of things continue to be felt. But those are some of the ones that stood out to me when I was writing this book.
Well, and you brought up the very important subject of Jean Dresselhaus, her husband, who of course was immensely supportive all throughout their lives. That been quite impossible for her to do what she did without all of the support that he offered. And I remember once being in an event with Millie where someone asked her, a young woman asked her, you've had this amazing and productive career, and yet you also have a family with 4 children. How do you do that? And she looked the woman right in the eye and said, marry the right person.
Yeah. Well, it is great advice if that is, what you want to do at that time. I mean, you don't have to get married to
but for her,
but
the reason she could make it work was because it was like a partnership.
Because she had decided to have a fairly large family, she and Jean together, and that is, very difficult when you're having research careers as well and teaching. So absolutely, she relied on Jean very much, and she also did have a full-time caregiver at their home who worked for them for many, many years. So, it's the whole, it takes a village thing. Like it really does take a village, even for Millie. And, I remember her son actually told me that at the beginning of her career, she was paying the caretaker, the nanny essentially, more than she was making in her salary. But that she felt that it was necessary as like a down payment on her career prospects. And, so she did, many of us do that. Childcare is expensive, although it's, rightly so that we pay our caregivers well. And so, she benefited from that. But certainly Jean just consistently throughout his life and career supported her in ways, obviously they actually work together very closely in many cases and in their actual research. But he was by all accounts someone who at home helped do 50% of the work with child rearing and just household chores, and he was always her cheerleader. And I certainly wanted this book to give a little bit of spotlight to him because I think he is really overlooked in her story in many of the more contemporary articles about Millie. He was a collaborator on many of her important and influential works, and yet very few people really know who he is outside of, condensed matter physics. So, yeah. And unfortunately, for those who don't know, he actually just passed away this past fall. So they lived a good chunk of their lives together, and they, are now buried together. And yeah.
I mean, for those of us in the field, certainly we've all always known that Gene was a very distinguished physicist in his own right, as well as being a wonderful scientific as well as personal partner to Millie. And so, we all recognize that. And he also has been recognized by our professional society in that way.
Yes.
So, we've talked about Millie being a member of an extremely underrepresented group at especially at the beginning of her career. And so talk a little bit about her influence on supporting underrepresented groups, especially women in STEM at MIT and elsewhere?
Sure. So at MIT, she joined the MIT faculty in 1967 as a visiting professor and became a full professor in 1968. So this was, before Title IX happened. It was before many women even were accepted in U.S. colleges and universities as students. So just the fact of her being on the MIT faculty at that time was remarkable. And, she was benefited from her visiting professorship was funded by one of the Rockefeller. It was by one of the daughters of the Rockefeller heirs, I guess. And she, was understood that her being there was actually what Margaret Rossiter, who's a historian of science, called coercive philanthropy, in the sense that some universities had these foundations and these purses essentially to specifically found faculty positions and postdocs and things like this for women to try to get them to come on board and when they hadn't really been accepted previously. So she knew when she joined the faculty that she wanted to do something very specifically to help with that effort, just because she felt it was a little bit part of her mandate for being there. And one of the first things that she looked at MIT was admissions. Now, MIT, I should say, was MIT has accepted women for a very long time, much longer than most universities in the nation. But it was in a very ad hoc way. MIT did not have like a standard process for admitting women. And what Millie and one of her colleagues, Emily Wick, found was that they actually looked at admissions applications, and they really found that it was harder for women to get into MIT than it was for men, for a number of reasons. And so one of the very first things that she did was, connect with the MIT administration and just point out, look, there's these biases here, and just in how you're accepting women, and the criteria that you're looking at is completely different. And so she and Emily Wick were really able to level the playing field in a lot of different ways in that sense. But then she also was one of the founding members of something called the MIT Women's Forum, which was sort of a group that looked at question of, what is the climate like for women at MIT? And, I think this was something that she kind of replicated in a number of ways in other organizations around, in her career. But that was one of the early ways that she really helped women. And I will also say she was always very, comfortable and, impactful in terms of lifting up people of minority backgrounds, people of color, especially women of color when possible, international students. And, there were many opportunities for her to, she, for instance, started another course with Sheila Widnall, who was one of the other very early faculty members in the MIT engineering school, that was called What is Engineering? And basically the idea was to, again, level the playing field a little bit for students who were coming into MIT who didn't have a little bit more of a background. Like, let's say they didn't have a father who was an engineer, or they didn't have, like they didn't go to engineering camp, or like robotics didn't really exist back then, but does something like that. And they, she was able to really increase the enrollment for students of color, as well as women and women of color, to, start either thinking about careers in engineering or in physics or in other science areas, or at the very least thinking about maybe like a minor. So they would take a certain number of courses and broaden their horizons that way. So those are sort of two of the, early things that she did, but clearly throughout her career, she also just, she worked very directly with, students. She very much was happy to accept students in her own group. And she really supported students who needed extra help. And I think someone actually told me that she thought that she especially wanted to help students who needed extra help. And that's unique. I think some professors, would rather just go about their day with their teaching and they're happy to do their office hours, but they're not necessarily going to go the extra mile, not because they don't want to, but just there's a limited amount of time. Well, Millie was someone who went above and beyond for certain students and really just, in some cases made or break whether they stayed at MIT or whether they went into science at all. And so, yeah.
She once said to me that I try every year to take into my group many students, but one weak student, one student who needs more help to get to their full potential. And she certainly did that.
That does not surprise me.
And she also once said to me that, every year I try to do one thing for women in science, just make sure that there's at least one every year. Of course, there was always more than one, but she never went a year without having some project that was
a big project
to uplift women. And one that I worked with her on, or she brought me into, is more to the point, is an ongoing program now, of which she was one of the founding mothers, which is a Climate for Women site visit program, where a physics department can ask a group of senior women to come and assess the climate for women and offer suggestions on how to improve it. And so for me, participating in that as a more junior member of the team and watching Millie in action, I was really learned a lot about how do you tell difficult news to people in ways that will result in change rather than just resulting in people getting their backs up and digging in their heels. So I learned a great deal that stood me in very good stead when I became a department chair. And so that another form of mentorship on her part.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that story that you told about the first climate site visits, for those who don't already know, Laurie is mentioned briefly in my book about this very issue. And that's one of the reasons why I was very curious to chat with you about this. Because, the idea that Millie would go around with other people, of course, and, review what was happening at other departments and be able to give that difficult news, with a smile, just kind of embodies her attitude and, just the way that she got things done.
I mean, she knew about her, she understood her stature in the field and understood that people would listen to something from her that they would not listen to from someone of less, who was less eminent, shall we say. And so she took hold of that and used it in very effective ways.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about sort of her life and social aspects, but we haven't really touched very much on the science. So from what you've learned, I know you're not a physicist, but from what you learned in researching Millie's life, what do you regard as being her major accomplishments, the things that she really will be remembered for forever?
Sure. Well, I think one of the ways that I kind of dove into this is, again, like when she was still living, I would actually go to her office, outside of her office, the night before the Nobels, the chemistry Nobel and the physics Nobel every year. And, I didn't quite know exactly like how, much of a chance she had. And looking back, she probably didn't have that much of a chance just because many of the awards that she was related to had already sort of been won. But it gave me a sense of, why she was regarded as someone who was foundational in the field of carbon nanoscience and carbon nanotechnologies. And, she didn't only look at carbon, but those were certainly her wheelhouse areas. When she first started, carbon was a material that was not really looked at in any kind of way as something that could, have immense payoffs. When she was first starting her career, it was really people were really looking at semiconducting materials, which of course became the basis for computing machines and are still so today. But, she and Jean at the time, thought that there was something fishy about the fact that carbon had some interesting properties, or it seemed like they might have some interesting properties, but her colleagues at the time thought carbon was too difficult and labyrinthine of a system to really work out. So, throughout the years, she was able to really dive into the properties of, she started with graphene. So I'm sorry, with graphite. Graphite is, the bulk form of carbon that you can find in your pencil or any normal pencil. At that time, she wasn't able to like really pry the layers of graphite apart. Whereas now, of course, we can isolate layers of graphene, which essentially stack up to form graphite. Her early work looked at, what happens when you mix graphite with other chemicals and other materials, and what happens to the optical properties, the magnetic properties, the electronic properties, heat, and all of these things. And she and Jean and their colleagues, really lay the foundations for just very basic information about how these things might work in materials made from either graphite itself or these concoctions of graphite with other things. Later, starting in the 80s, other forms such as carbon buckyballs, which are basically balls of carbon molecules, and then elongated balls, which if you chop off the ends are known as carbon nanotubes. These forms of carbon have since been used in so many applications that they really are all around us, from the batteries in your cell phone and the screen of your cell phone to the material that makes airplanes lighter and more efficient than they were back in the 70s. There's so many different like composite materials that are used. If you buy certain bikes these days, certain sporting equipment, have carbon fiber and reinforcement. You have water filtration systems that use graphene, which again is like just the single layer of carbon atoms. And some of her foundational work looked at what would happen if you changed the location of certain atoms. What if you changed certain configurations? For instance, with carbon nanotubes, she realized that the way that the way that the atoms are arranged in a carbon nanotube can actually really change whether it's superconducting or just conducting in a positive way, or whether it's more I don't know if it's less conducting, more heat conducting, more electricity. And so, those things were really foundational for later discoveries and later applications in various tech areas. I mean, medicine, there are sensors in like nanosensors these days that are being used to help, detect disease. It's just kind of all over the place. So she did not ultimately win a Nobel Prize for these things. But, in fact, the last carbon related prize that was given in 2010, she was mentioned in the speeches of the two winners as an inspiration and someone whose work that they based it on. So she really did play a major role in that way. What would you think? Well, does that because I know that you work in this field as well. So what's your takeaway?
I mean, for anyone working in the field of carbon nowadays and over the last decades, particularly in nanoscience and nanotubes and buckyballs and so forth, she wrote, I mean, with other co-authors, two books about the subject that were on everybody's desk. They were basically the sacred texts of carbon science. And so anyone working in carbon science and really in nanoscience more generally regards her as being one of the pillars that made the field what it is today. Yeah. And then even beyond her work in carbon, of course, later toward the end of her career, she got interested in thinking about thermoelectric materials, which are ways of converting energy between the form of heat and the form of electricity, which is obviously a very critical element for green technologies moving forward, and small battery elements and so forth. And so that was, again, a whole new area which she made tremendous contributions and got a lot of people excited about the field. I mean, thermoelectrics have been known for a century, but they weren't I was going to say weren't a hot field, but that's maybe not the right word, but that they weren't something that there was a lot of active work being done, despite their potential, and she really got people interested in them and moved that field forward, not only through her own work, but also through work that she inspired and through getting people involved in it. And so it's we're coming up to the last part of our discussion. I see that we do have a question in the Q&A, and I would invite people to put more questions in if you have any. We have a question that says, what does her research have to do with fullerenes and buckyballs, and what would we not have today if there hadn't been Millie? And I think we've touched on a good bit of that, but like I said, for anyone working in this field, the field would hardly exist without Millie. I mean, there were discoveries that were made that were not her discoveries, but really digging down and understanding the basic physics of these very tiny structures is something that Millie really was the leader in the field, and in very prescient ways. Before buckyballs were discovered, she was teaching a class, a graduate class in solid state physics, and one of the homework problems she gave to the students involved calculating the electronic states, a certain mathematical calculation about a structure that was in fact the structure that was ultimately discovered to be the buckyball. It was not known at that time, but she had the idea that if you had this symmetry, that would have some very interesting properties. And so she gave it to the students as a homework problem. And they were mad later that she hadn't published that. It would have been a pioneering discovery, but she looked at it as, oh, this is something that students should learn how to calculate. So really, there's a lot that would never have happened, or certainly would have happened much, much later if Millie hadn't been a pioneer in this scientific field.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add that, so many people have told me that one of her contributions is really giving ideas to other colleagues and to students and to postdocs that she worked with. And, in many cases, they went off and did the research and they published the papers, and sometimes she was on it and sometimes not. But she's just, her ideas were so free flowing in terms of like, wouldn't this be interesting? I feel like that was her favorite catchphrase. Wouldn't this be interesting? Or would that be interesting? The applications that came out of it are just so varied. I mean, graphene right now is like a multi-billion-dollar industry. Other examples of things that are being worked on right now are like quantum computing. Quantum computers we're still working on getting there, but right now, how graphene layers might help enable quantum computers. That is something that is actively being worked out. And she was one of the people who was working on, the superposition of graphene layers in weird angles before, magic angle graphene became a thing. So basically, if you take 2 layers of graphene or multiple layers of graphene and pose them in certain directions, you can get superconducting states. And these are the kinds of things that people are thinking might help enable quantum computers, which would be, a just giant leap in our abilities in terms of computing. I think there are a lot of applications in medicine that are just, baby applications now, but could be, hugely, hugely important. But then you also have applications like one of her first her first PhD students, Deborah Chung, she developed smart concrete, which is a way to infuse concrete with carbon fibers such that it can sense strain and, make sure that the systems are, working properly and acting efficiently and this kind of thing. So that exists, that's out there right now. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Well, that sort of addresses or brings us to another question that's in the Q&A, which is, if she had lived another 25 years, what do you think she would have been able to accomplish? And I think you're bringing her work forward to quantum computing is certainly the way I would respond to that. I think a lot of the ideas about nanoscience that she was a continuous fountain of would have certainly been worked out, and it would continue to advance this very exciting field of quantum science, quantum computing, quantum information, all of these things that rely on the physics of the very, very tiny. in ways that Millie, I think, understood and would be continuing to contribute to that if she were to live to be, what, 103 or how old would you be in 25 years?
She would be in her 90s now, but
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I still work in the MIT news office, and today was just another example. We constantly still have work coming from her former faculty colleagues, and I just come across these now having known a little bit more about her work after doing this project, and thinking, I know Millie worked on this. Like, she would have been on this paper, or she would have been advising or something, or even just at the very basic, like, it's a graphene paper, so clearly she played a major role in even just making this paper happen 30, 40, 50 years ago. So
yeah, those people read the sacred texts of carbon science, which she wrote.
Yes, exactly.
And there's a question in the Q&A about who has picked up Millie's baton in terms of both the science and her equalizing opportunity, her work in equalizing opportunities for women and minorities in physics. What would you say about that?
Well, that's a good question. I think she inspired so many women and people of color and international students and postdocs, faculty members in this area. So I think I really want to say that she had a very large network of people who are now taking her message forward. And I will offer one example, which I do mention in the book, which is the woman who actually now sits in Millie's old office is a young scientist who is working in her same general area. And she not only is a really promising engineer and physicist and scientist, but she also actually is, helping to organize events at MIT and more broadly around the country, looking at supporting women in STEM fields. And her name's Farnaz Nurui, and she, for instance, actually started the Mildred Dresselhaus lecture series at MIT Nano through MIT Nano. And so, I mean, she's one person who, I feel has Millie's baton and is definitely taking it. I will also offer that Millie has 5 grandchildren, and several of them are themselves scientists. And some of them are in her same field, really. So, some of her grandkids are actually directly taking the baton. But really, she, as I said, reached so many people that, it's hard to pinpoint just one person, because her influence was a very large web.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, there's so many broad fields that really everyone in them is there and doing the work that they're doing in some sense because of what Millie did, that it builds on what she did. And then the same is true when it comes to working for advancing the cause of women in science, and especially in physics, that there's so many of us who work on these sorts of things, and we're able to do what we do because of what Millie did in her time. I mean, she was, of course, the generation earlier than me, and I walk in her shadow in that regard, but try to bring things forward. So I think that you can't count the number of people, because it's there are so many, both scientifically and in regard to social conditions within science. So I think we may have time for another question or two if people want to put them in the Q&A. We'll be happy to see if we can address them.
I see some in the chat. I don't know if it's the same as the Q&A. Do you want me to just go ahead?
Yeah. This would be a question especially important for you about whether Millie kept any personal journals or letters or things like that about the challenges for women in science. Do you have anything like that to draw on as you wrote your book?
That's a really good question. So Millie passed away in February of 2017, and I really started writing the book about a year later. We started talking about the book shortly after she passed away. But the reality is, her papers were not yet donated to MIT at that time. And actually, I have not actually gone and seen all of the papers that are currently at the MIT library. So I was working with a much smaller subset of her, available I don't want to say memoirs, but she had oral histories. So I don't want to say that, I'm sure she probably does have some of that. I don't know how available it is to historians at this point. But she wrote very prolifically and very honestly in some ways, I think. I mean, I can't know for sure because I don't, have a journal to compare. But, she wrote so many different retrospectives and about her career. And she wrote not just, she was often writing about the history of her field, but then she also was writing about being a woman in science and engineering. And she did this for audiences all over the place. I mean, in like the mid 70s, she was interviewed by, Cosmopolitan magazine. And, this was, the audience is teenage girls to this day and then. And so she really there were many, many opportunities for me to look at her writing and her interviews and her oral histories that she gave. And she definitely mentioned, the conditions that she was dealing with. The question of a more personal, behind the scenes look, I'm sure that does exist at some point. I'm not 100% sure, but, most of us at some point have some kind of journal, but I don't know, I haven't seen letters. I saw one letter from Gene to his mom, professing his love for Millie, but I didn't really get into that aspect. This book was really, originally I was told not to do, or that I didn't have to do any original research, that it was actually going to be a really short book. I ended up going to 20,000 words over my contracted limit and the MIT Press was, gracious enough to let me keep it. So, it was a little bit more limited in scope. So hopefully someday we'll learn a little bit more about, those personal things that we might not have gotten into. But, I definitely did do a whole bunch of original research for it. And I feel like I did get into some aspects that were not out there already. So hopefully you'll enjoy reading about those in the book.
Yeah, well, those of us who knew Millie and have had a chance to read the book are certainly grateful that you did go beyond what the original conception was, because it really, I mean, to me, even having known Millie for decades, it really fleshed out, especially a lot of her early history, but aspects of her life that I was not familiar with or was only familiar with in part. And so I'm very grateful to you and MIT Press for having produced this book.
Thank you. No, it was great fun to do. I mean, it definitely was a long process for me, since this is sort of a side project. But, Millie has become someone who I just feel like I know very intimately. And it's a little strange having only met her. I only met her one time in 2014. Some of you might know that I make little Lego minifigures that sort of celebrate mostly women in science and engineering. And I had made one of her and offered to bring it over to her office. And she emailed me back right away and was like, we have a picture of it on the board already and people love to come see it. So that was pretty cool. So I did get to meet her the one time. But it's just been this long process where you write about someone who you can't really actually have a conversation with. And so I do feel like she's kind of a part of my life now. But, there are always questions that you'll wonder about. So,
well, perhaps somewhere down the line, either you or someone else will write that sort of more full critical biography that because she's certainly a subject who deserves that kind of full treatment. And
yeah, absolutely.
Many of us who would really benefit from reading and learning more about her remarkable life and career. So do you want to hold up the book and show us what the cover looks like?
I actually do not have a copy of the book right here, but I do instead have this little minifigure that we made to sort of celebrate the book. And it's sort of, it has the same photo as the cover. And it talks about the book in the back. So we made these kind of as promotional items. And you have the book there. Excellent. Thank you.
I have to unblur myself to maybe allow you to see it, but
yeah. Yeah, the photo that was the cover, I was really pleased that we got to use. My understanding is that it was taken for the event of her winning the L'Oreal UNESCO Women in Science Award. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I'm 99% sure about that. And, it's just such a beautiful photo of her, and it just exudes this, warmth that she gave off. And it sort of showed her in her, traditionally her Scandinavian sweater that she would always wear. She had a couple of them, but that was one of them. And so I was really happy with that. But yeah.
So, well, it's been a great pleasure for me to talk with you about a subject whom we mutually love, although you never had a chance to do so in person. And so it's been a great pleasure to be here today with you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. It was really great chatting with you, and I really appreciate your insights and your stories about Millie. And it's just thank you also to Politics and Prose, Alyssa. Thank you for being here. I hope everybody is able to get inspired by Millie's story. It's one that really took me by surprise when I heard about just how far she came and how beloved she became in her community and around the world.
Oh, I couldn't turn my mic back on. Thank you both, Maia and Laurie, for being here today, for taking the time to be here, and really for that wonderful and very inspiring conversation. I'd also like to thank the audience here today, as your patronage is really what allows us to bring you programming like this, and we wouldn't be able to keep hosting these events without the book sales to support them. So please support Maia Weinstock as well as Politics and Prose by using the link which we posted in the chat to purchase Carbon Queen. And now you know what the cover looks like.
There you go.
And be sure to keep an eye on our website for our current event listings, as we have plenty of excellent events to attend virtually as well as in person. Thank you again to Maia and Laurie for joining us today. Keep well read, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.